Hi, welcome back to Legally Bound. Today we're going to talk about one of the most popular topics out there, drunk sex. Now, we may all like drunk sex in some form or fashion, but here we're going to talk about some more specific legal stuff. So when is it legal? When is it illegal? Let's talk about some rumors, myths out there, and really set the record straight.
When is it legal or illegal to do what?
Can you have sex when you are drunk? Can you give consent to sex if you are drunk?
That's the big question. Mm-hmm. I mean, that's really like the thing that is going on every college campus, across the military, and we'll talk about that in a minute, and really just in society generally. It's the awakening and understanding that sexual assault really does happen quite frequently, and that it is a priority in our society to eradicate it. I mean, even as criminal defense attorneys, we have a very strong belief and passion to eradicate sexual assault from our society. That is a top priority. It's for us as well as for everybody, but we can't allow people's civil liberties, their rights, their freedoms to be jeopardized in the process. Because although some people deny this, the truth is very real, that there are both those who commit sexual assault and those who falsely accuse others of sexual assault. Right. And we must, as a society, make sure that fairness and justice is present at all times.
Right, exactly. So today when we're talking about sexual assault claims and we insinuate that some are false, that's because that's the truth. There are false sexual assault claims out there. Mm-hmm. But to get back to the topic of the day here, I think let's start with like a couple Q&A questions, if that's okay.
Okay.
Because I feel like that will just really set the record straight on some stuff that's out there. So I've heard some rumors that if you are drunk, or even if you drank alcohol at all, that you cannot consent to sex under the law. Is that true?
False.
Okay. And we're going to talk more about why this is in a second. True or false? If your blood alcohol content is 0.08 or higher, which is the legal limit for DUI in a lot of states, you cannot consent to sexual intercourse or sexual
False.
activity.
There is no BAC cutoff for consent to sexual activity.
Okay. My last question, true or false? There is a drink limit that if you drink more than a certain amount of drinks, let's say 5 drinks, that you cannot, after that point, consent to sexual activity.
Although that is false, and although there's a lot of victims groups that have put that out there, and maybe even some legislation that was attempted to pass, I know of no place in America where there is a drink limit to when you can't consent to sex. With that, will you define sexual assault a little bit better? Because I think a lot of people don't exactly understand what is and is not sexual assault, and it's pretty easy to break down.
Yes, so the idea of sexual assault and rape, those are kind of used interchangeably, but for our purposes of discussion here, we're talking about any sexual activity, whether it's actual intercourse or even just touching or forcible violent rape. They can all fall under the umbrella of sexual assault.
And it's all this idea that there was a lack of consent, that yes, consent is a necessary element to any sort of sexual activity, and without it, it is a sexual assault. And the way in which consent can or cannot be given, that's what we're talking about. Because on one end of it is just the straight up, a person who's fully conscious and awake and sober, they have the ability to say yes, or they have the ability to say no. And if they communicated a lack of consent by saying no, or however they communicated that, then it's a sexual assault. On the other far extreme is somebody who's totally incapacitated, whether it's because of they're asleep or they're unconscious, blacked out because of alcohol, not blacked out, passed out because of alcohol. That's that extreme. Somebody who is unconscious literally cannot communicate their consent. But it's that whole area in the middle.
Yeah, and I think you made a good point. So if you, regardless of whether you drink any alcohol at all, if you say no, then that's sexual assault. If there's a continued sexual act, doesn't matter your alcohol level or lack thereof. Okay, so that's one way.
You can change your mind, but if you said no and following that sex occurs,
what that analysis has nothing to do with alcohol. Okay, not necessarily at least. You can say no, stone cold sober, and it's still no, or you can say yes while you have some alcohol in your system, and it might be okay. So the point is, as lawyers love to say, it really depends on the facts of each case. So when we're talking about drinking alcohol, is there a point in time, true or false, or I guess not true or false, but question for you, is there a point in time when somebody could drink too much alcohol to consent?
Yeah,
is that possible?
It's very simple. Although the definition of the simple term is not so easy, but it's this: can somebody appreciate the nature of the act? The nature of the sexual activity.
And you're saying if you're the one saying I was sexually assaulted because I was too drunk, we're talking in the narrow version of sexual assault claims that come about because I was too drunk. Mm-hmm. This is a long conversation, sexual assault. We could talk about that for weeks. But this is
and we'll treat this as part one to our let's talk about drunk sex because there's a lot to talk about.
Well, even just the drunk sex. But for the purposes of our discussion here, we're talking about a person that is making an allegation that they were raped or sexually assaulted because they were too drunk. So how do we know if somebody was in fact too drunk?
Can they appreciate the nature of the act? Do they know what's going on, and can they communicate essentially yes or no to what's going on?
How do you figure that out with the person?
See, I think, and I do this a lot in court because I've got to talk about it to a jury, because that term, can you appreciate the nature of it? Well, I mean, are we talking, I know the difference between, all of the details of what's going on, or do I just generally kind of know what's going on, but I'm really intoxicated? Well, there's different ways to say that. I think that it comes down to this. Do you understand that it's a sexual act, that it's a thing that you don't want in a place that you don't want it, as opposed to, the understanding that somebody's got a finger in your ear versus they're touching your genitals? I mean, there's a difference there. Do you understand the difference as to what's going on? And if that's the case and you can still communicate, that's kind of the level of appreciating the nature of the act.
Okay, so I think at the end you kind of hit on it. So how would you show that in court? How do you show that somebody did or didn't reach a level of drunkenness where they were not able to consent under the law?
Yeah, so
how drunk do you have to be? Just give me the answer.
You have to be so drunk that you don't really know what's going on. So somebody who would describe, and we've heard this before, I was laying in bed, the room was absolutely spinning, somebody came in, they were, I couldn't really tell what they were doing to me, and I was in and out of consciousness. That person can't consent. This is a person who can't understand what's happening to her. She says she can't understand it. She kind of has these visions, these flashes of something that occurred. Under that circumstance, no other facts being present, that could be a person who can't consent.
Okay, and I have another question for you, because I think the questions may be helpful. So is it true that a lot of people who can't consent under the law are so intoxicated that they may be vomiting or even urinating on themselves, or losing control of some bodily function? Is that one way that you might be able to be too drunk to consent to sex?
Yeah, I mean, there's all sorts of ways in which prosecutors and defense attorneys fight about this idea of whether somebody can or cannot appraise the nature of the act. And I think the bottom line that I'm trying to communicate, that I'm trying to show, is this: that it is a very high level. Somebody who is otherwise drunk, who can still say yes or no. At the end of the night, when somebody's ready to go home, do they know what they're doing? I need to take a taxi cab. Did they walk in the wrong direction because they don't know up from down anymore? That's kind of that line in the sand. Just because you're drunk and your inhibitions are lower doesn't mean you can't consent. And that's right. What we see a lot, is a lot of these claims end up being regret-based, or I can't believe that I would have, I wouldn't have, I never liked him, I wouldn't have done that if I was...
I have a boyfriend, I have a husband, or whatever. Those are examples, not every case. But I mean, truthfully speaking, that kind of brings me to another point about alcohol and sex. And I don't want to get into this. This will be like a little teaser for next time. But what if you drink so much that you enter into a blackout? And we all know that a blackout is basically a time when your memory is not actually recording. So your long-term memory is not recording. So you're still functioning, but you don't remember it. You don't have a memory literally recorded in your brain. So people can tell you later, like, do you remember when you jumped on top of the bar and started dancing? And you could have no genuine memory of that happening, and there could be a video of it. That doesn't mean that you didn't choose to do that. It just means you didn't remember that you chose to do that.
So in part one of drunk sex, here's what I'm going to summarize for you. Number one, sexual assault is any sort of sexual activity without consent. Number two, a person who is so drunk that they can no longer appreciate the nature of the act, the sexual act, cannot consent. And number three, drunk people certainly can consent all the way up to that line, because drunk people often do things they wouldn't do when they're sober, but they wanted to do it in that moment. And the law is not going to hold other people accountable for those bad decisions for their voluntary drinking.
Yeah.
Now, the final point that you're talking about here, I mean, I think you've got to kind of wrap that up.
Sure. So what I'm talking about, if there's proof, and this happens at trial in very many ways, there's proof that a person was drinking and maybe even lost memory, but was making decisions that were reasonable, that were normal, that were, their own decisions. That
it doesn't matter if they can't remember it.
Exactly.
So these
That's
blackouts,
not the point.
you know that sometimes people who black out, they're playing a game of pool at the bar. They don't remember the next day that they lost and they owe their buddy $20 because they were stupidly betting on a pool game, but they still owe the money because, they were playing pool together and he said, I want to play pool. The same thing can happen in a bedroom. Just because you don't remember it the next day doesn't mean that in that moment you didn't want it and say yes.
Just on the other side, it doesn't mean that you did. But that's for the lawyers to kind of hash out. But as a going in position, there's no hard and fast rule if you were in a blackout, you didn't consent, or if you drank alcohol, you didn't consent. That's just not the case.
Part
not
two,
the law.
we'll give some examples on how that goes both ways, both for people who end up winning the case who are accused and victims who are able to establish and prove that their case was legitimate and locked the bad guy up for a long time. Until next time, we are legally bound.